Hello, class. For this video, the primary purpose is going to be walking through the test questions. Um, we'll be doing the full review quiz, which has extra test questions. And so as we're going to go through this, I'm primarily going to be working with that assignment. I'll talk a little bit about like which topics are more important here and there, and just kind of give you some journal study tips. So let me start by bringing up that study guide that I posted. So I've already posted the online study guide, has all the dates. So just as a quick review, this test is now open. It is due by 11:59 p.m. this Sunday, the 14th. I'm assuming that most of you will be taking it online, which means you'll be using HonorLock. Um, we've had discussions of that. If we need more, it'll be a separate video. I know at least a couple of you are coming to the campus to take it. I have one person I know taking it during regular office hours, and then I'll be proctoring somebody on Sunday. So, if Honor Lodge not worked for you, and we know, a couple days ahead of time, then I can work with you to get it taken. All right. So, as to the test itself. Mhm. So this is chapter 5 and most of chapter 6. We will be doing a little bit of chapter 6 in the next unit. I know we spent like the amount of time you spent on the homework stuff, it may feel like it's 50-50 split. But one thing with the chapter 5, it's mostly arithmetic. A lot of that is, what I would call calculator friendly topics, like the fractions and the more basic order of operations and the integers. So there's not as many of those topics as you might think on the test. I did find ways to incorporate those like later in the algebra stuff. But the chapter 5 is maybe 35-40% of the test. I would say section 6.2, which is the basic equations, the multi-step equations, and the proportions. That one section is probably a third of the test. So I'm definitely got to be able to do all that stuff in 6.2. And then there's 6.1, which is the expressions, and 6.3, which is the formulas. That's the rest of the test. All right. So how do you study for a math exam? Well, hopefully, you've been doing your work, and so that's the first part of it. If there are still several people that are still working on 6.1, you're going to have a ton of work to do this week, which basically means you're not going to be actually do much studying. You're going to be focusing on doing work and then kind of jumping straight into the exam. You might get away with it for this unit where we're doing mostly review topics. Later units when we're doing new material, if you are in the habit of being behind and cramming at the end, it's not going to go as well. I've seen it happen semester after semester. So so you're going to have to watch out for that. All right, so let me get into Math Lab. And so in Math Lab, again, the best view of what's the test going to look like are these quizzes. All right, so most of you are doing your skill check quizzes. There were a couple of homeworks. You have a skill check quiz that are 5 to 8 questions. Don't forget that when I wrote the test, the first thing I did was pull questions from every quiz. And so I'd say maybe 90% of the test questions come directly from the quizzes. The other 10% is I went back in the homework and pulled out random problems here and there to kind of make the flow a little bit better. But those quizzes, your mindset should be if you miss it on the quiz, you're going to miss it on the test unless you figure out why you missed it in the quiz. I do have so if you're only taking the quiz once, you're not prepping for the test properly. Right. So you need to be taking these quizzes multiple times and figuring out what you're missing and why. All right. In addition to the skill check quizzes, well, that exam H again, that's our on-lock practice. I think last time I looked just a little bit ago, I think I'm almost half the classes now got that done. So I think that little email I sent helped with that. But again, you need to figure out how to use on-lock before you take the test. That's what exam H is for. That is open until Friday. There's some stragglers, and I want you to be able to kind of figure out honor lock separately than the actual exam. Okay. Now, what I'm going to spend most of my time today is going over that full review. Um, the difference between the full review and the mini review is once I made the test, which is, it's exam H1. For those who come to campus, I did do a separate test. I realize now that I didn't need to, so it doesn't, those of you coming to campus, doesn't matter which one of those you take. But for, exam H1 is our test for those of you who taking it online. Once I made that test, I copied it, and then I went in and added extra problems because I'm not going to give you the exact test to study. Um, but what I did was like, if there was 4 order of operations on the exam, I put in like 3 extra order of operations to give you variety. So there is nothing on the exam that's not in the full review. Now it is optional, it's not required. I did make it 1 point, so that way it would show up in your calendars and Blackboard. But if you don't do it, it's not gonna hurt your grade. But I often find that people that look through it, even if they don't do all the problems, do better on the exams. That's what it's there for. The mini review. The mini review is this time it's 13 questions. And so what that is, it's basically it's a half a test. So I would recommend that at some point before you take the actual exam, give yourself 30 minutes, take this mini review just like you would the exam. You don't get to use notes on this test. All you get is your calculator and scrap paper. No phones. Remember phones is cheating. That's the motto that comes to proctoring exams. So, but if you give yourself 30 minutes, take this test, take the mini review, then anything you miss on there, study before you take the exam. And so what the mini review is, there's like 1 order of operations problem and like 1 basic equation, like 1 equation fraction. So you get to see like 1 of each type. So at least you have some idea what you're going to miss on the test or not. Okay. So let's talk about how to, use these quizzes to prep for the test. So let's get in there on sure I'm sharing this correctly. All right, so let's look at the full review. All right. So if one thing I would recommend that you do, when it comes to studying for math test, um, doing the homework is not studying. That's part of what you need to do to study. But one of like the biggest comments I get about tests from students who struggle on test is that they didn't know how to start the problem. Like if they could start it, then they could do okay. But starting it was the issue. Um, and so if that's the case, part of that happens is because we don't we don't teach you how to read the instructions as you're going through your math education. I think that's a big letdown. So I would highly recommend, even if you don't want to do the problems, open up this full review, put your pencil down, read the instructions. So here's number 1. Round to the nearest to the given place value. This is the thousands. So, where is the thousands place value? It's tenths, hundreds, thousands. So that's the third one. So you're rounding to 3. Do you know how to round that? Well, you look to the right. If it's 5 to 9, add 1. If it's 0 to 4, keep it the same. Just make sure, just read the instructions. Do you know the steps to that problem? Right? That's an excellent use of this full review. Let's see. Okay. I need to change this. I tried to do it so you could save it for later, but then it won't let you. Let me fix something right quick. Most quizzes, you need to finish all at once. Um, since this full review is like twice the length of the regular test, I don't expect people to do it in one sitting. Let me fix something right quick. So what I'd recommend on the full review is um, if you want to save it for later, just X out of it, and then join. It'll let you come back in. So this goes in the order of the actual test. So you're going to start with rounding. So here's nearest hundredth. Do you know the hundredth place value? And just kind of walk through these problems. Nearest tenth, that's TH is the decimal, tenth is the first one, so you're rounding the 9. And if you're comfortable with rounding, then you don't need to go through all of these questions. Like here it says round to there's 10. So now we're dealing with the 5. So you don't have to do the problem, just make sure that you know how to start it. If you want to work it through, great, but at least kind of read through the instructions. So now we get into fractions. Do you know how to make improper fractions and mixed numbers from a picture? I can guarantee you this will be a test question. Right? So improper fraction, make sure you get the denominator correct. So in this particular instance, all objects are divided up into 4 pieces. So the denominator is 4 because each piece is a fourth of the object. And then the top part is how many are shaded. So 4, 8, 12, 16, 17, 18, 19. So the improper fraction would be 19 fourths. So make sure you know how to set that up. Mixed numbers, however many are shaded total is your whole number, and then you do the fraction for just the partially shaded one. Yep. Like I said, and here's a couple of them. So like on the actual test, there'll be one. This is what I'm saying on the full review. I give you 2 of those because like I said, that's pretty much guaranteed a test question, one of those 2. Yep. And this is where, like in the homework, we had some where you just converted improper fractions and mixed numbers and vice versa. On the test, that's one of those things I cut out because again, that could be a calculator question, real easy. So what I did was I incorporated this, like here, you're going to have to multiply mixed numbers. How do you multiply mixed numbers? Well, you have to know to convert them to improper fractions first. Once you have improper fractions, then you multiply the top with the top, bottom with the bottom. At some point, you got to simplify. Okay. Same with division. You cannot multiply or divide mixed numbers. You got to change them to proper fractions first. Once you do that, the way you divide fractions is you're going to invert the second one, make it a multiply problem, and then go from there. And so for all of this fraction stuff, make sure that if you're still iffy with it, that you can use your calculator properly, because that is part of this test, is you are allowed to use your calculator, but it's also part of why there's not as many questions for chapter 5 on this test, is I'm not grading the calculator's work, I'm trying to grade your work. So here we have an addition of fractions. So what do you need to add fractions? You need a common denominator, which in this case is 20 because 4 will go into 20. So you need to convert that over into 20ths. And this is mixed numbers. You can add or subtract mixed numbers. I'd still recommend going to improper fractions first. So all that stuff with fractions, that's we spent a lot more time in the homework with fractions than it's going to appear on the test, mainly because of the calculator issue. But there are, fractions are going to pop up all over the place this semester. Okay. So here is a exponent with a negative number. So the real question on this negative 3 to the 4th, is this, when you write it out, how many negatives are there? Is there 1 or are there 4? If you look at number 11, this is negative 3 to the 4th without parentheses. So what is the difference here? This is one of those things that the calculator doesn't know what the original problem is, so you have to do this work yourself. Or the calculator will give you an answer no matter what. So what you have to know is that the top, since the negative's inside parentheses, that in this case is 4 negatives. And the bottom, since there's no parentheses, it's 1 negative. And so on the top, that's since you have 4 negatives, overall it's going to be positive. 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times 3 is 9. So 9 times 9 is 81. For the bottom one, we have 1 negative and we're multiplying, so that means overall the answer is negative. So that'll be a negative 81. And yes, you could put these in a calculator and get the right answer, but very often what happens, particularly in order of operation problems or evaluation problems, students won't use parentheses properly, and then the calculator just gives them an answer because the calculator will do that no matter what you plug in. So you have to know, like what the difference between these is. And that's definitely something that's going to show up on the test. All right, let's go back to the test. Yep. So know how to deal with exponents and negative signs. All right. Now, let's see. For some reason, let's see, the order of operations were supposed to be next. Let me skip to that. I changed it on the actual test. And so, we'll come back to the evaluate. So on the order of operation problems, expect several of those. They're going to start kind of like medium level and then get messier. All right. I didn't put any too basic ones on the test because again, one, you've practiced, and two, you have the calculator. Um, for problems like this, yes, you could theoretically put them in your calculator all at once. But if you do that and you do it incorrectly, give me a wrong answer, you're not going to get any partial credit. So I highly recommend that you get for the test, write down as much work as you can and like use your calculator for like doing -6 times -9 rather than doing it all at once. And so we're going to start out with medium level problems in order of operations, and then we'll get into some with exponents, and then we get into like messier ones with brackets, and then we'll have some with fractions. Don't forget, absolute value is fair game in order of operations. So like on this one, that absolute value 2 minus 6, you would do 2 minus 6 is -4. Absolute value that's +4. So that would be part of your order of operations. All right. So just to warn you on the test, the order of operations are like medium to messier ones. And I think there's 4 of them, maybe 3 or 4 on the actual test. Yeah. So after you do order of operations, and again, on the full review, I gave you several. The ones on the test are in the full review. All right, so after you do the order of operations, then you're going to get into chapter 6, which is simplify algebraic expressions. So let me write this one down. So one of the problems when it comes to test time is that students mix up simplifying with um, solving. Get this over here so you can see it. All right, so for a problem like this, where it says simplify. So simplify means basically do your add and subtracting, your distribution if there is any. And so to do this, we have our like terms. We have 2x plus 6x. Those are our like terms, so you add those. Don't do the opposite because we're not on an equal sign. We're not moving terms across the equal sign. This is just like one, there is one side here. So don't do opposites, just do whatever it says. So 2x plus 6x is 8x. And then 8 minus 6 gives us -2. And then this is where you have to know to stop. So the biggest mistake I find on these on the test is students want to go ahead and solve this. And so they'll do things like either add 2 and then divide by 8, or maybe they'll just divide by 8. They're treating this like an equal sign and trying to isolate the variable. This is not a solve. This is a simplify. This is not an equation because it doesn't have an equals in the middle of the problem. Okay, so on the test, watch out for that. You're going to do order of operation problems. You're going to do some evaluation problems where you're plugging in numbers and then doing the order of operations. Then you'll be doing simplified problems. Then you'll be getting into solving. So when it says simplify, don't abstract like terms, don't solve, just do your combined like terms, do your distribution, and you're done. Okay, so for example, here is my 14 on the full review. So we have 2 parentheses 2y minus 3 minus parentheses 3y plus 5. And this is a simplified problem, not a solve. Okay, so what do we do first? Well, order of operations says look inside grouping symbols. 2y minus 3, 3y plus 5 are unlike terms, so we cannot add them. So now we go to outside parentheses with some distribution. So on this side, we're multiplying by 2. So that gives you 4y minus 6. Now for this minus outside this parentheses, you either think 2 ways, most people think this, either opposite of, which means you're going to change the signs. So since they both start positive, both go negative, or a lot of people like to put a -1 there and then distribute a -1. So -1 times +3 gives you -3y, -1 times +5 gives you -5. So notice both those signs changed. Started positive, now both negative. The most common mistake with a problem like this, students will not distribute the negative to the second term. They'll get it on the first term, but not the second. Okay. Once you distribute, now we're back to extracting like terms. So now we have 4y minus 3y, which is 1y. And then we have -6 minus 5, which is -11. You could leave it as 1y minus 11. But in the final answer, if there was a 1 from a variable, we tend to drop it and just say y. I would accept 1y minus 11. Usually MATLAB is fairly good about equivalent answers, but remember on the test, if you miss something, I will go back and look at your answer. I'll go back and look at your work. Some of these problems, like if you missed it because MATLAB didn't like the 1 there, I'd give you full credit. I would need to look at your work because I can tell from your answer that you got it. But this is where, like, if you made a mistake up here in the distribution and you just gave me a wrong answer, didn't show any work, you're not going to get partial credit. So, I know you may not be doing all this when you're doing your homework because you may not need to, but for the test, show work. All right. So that's 6.1 stuff. I'm looking for my evaluation problems. I'm not seeing them at the moment. All right. Okay, I'll have to look at that. I don't know why there should be evaluation problems in the full review. I'll have to check on that after this video. All right. So, but the evaluation problems, that's where you just plug we give you numbers for X and Y, you plug it in and do order of operations. Yeah. All right. So then you get into the equation solving. And so this is the 6.2 stuff. Again, this is altogether, this is a third of the test. So it's the basic equations. So like here, when I say basic, it's like 1-step or 2-step equations. Then we get into the multi-step equations, which means variables on both sides. They're going to be messier with maybe some distribution or combining like terms to deal with. Definitely going to have an equation or two with fractions that you're going to have to deal with. And then we have proportions. Okay. So this one starts off small, -8x equals 32. Just divide both sides by -8. Pretty straightforward. All right. This is a basic equation you need to be able to solve. So this is my number 26. Now, before I get into the actual problem itself, just as a reminder, MATLAB has this part B and part C, or option B and option C. So the solution set, when it says X is the set X, this is set X such that X is a real number. This is saying that there are infinite solutions. We're not dealing with that for this class. The option C that says the solution set is the empty set, which means there is no answer. again, we're not dealing with B or C for this class. This is more college algebra level equations. So for all our equations, you should be selecting A and then telling me what the answer is. Okay. If you select B or C, that pretty much guarantees that you got it wrong. All right, so let's work through this one right quick. Now, if you do select B or C, it doesn't guarantee you get no points, because if you have work and then something happened in the work that led you to B or C, then you can still possibly get partial credit. Can't say until I see what work you have. And the way I do partial credit is if you make an arithmetic mistake, that's 1 point off typically, or like if you mistype if you like put the wrong problem down on your paper, sometimes I take off half a point, sometimes maybe 1 point, sometimes no points. It sort of depends. Um, but I do like a typo at most would be 1 point off. Um, if you make a conceptual mistake because like let's say that you are subtracting 6 here, that's a conceptual mistake because that's not the opposite operation. That's at least half off on the problem. Anyway, so hopefully by now, by the time you get to test, this should be pretty straightforward. We're solving for x, so we're going to add 5 to both sides. 6x equals 12. And 6 times x. So you should be dividing by 6. Again, don't change the signs when you are multiplying dividing. Get x equals 2. Okay. So again, pretty straightforward, hopefully, by this point. Um, that's what this test is going to do, is it's going to start small and work its way up. Let me go back to the actual test, or the full test. All right, so the next problem I have is 4 parentheses 8x minus 9 equals 48. So what's the first step there? Well, on this left sign, you have a distribution to do. So you would do 4 times 8, which is 32x, 4 times -9, which is minus 36. Once you do that, you're right back to what we started, or what we did last time. Okay. All right, so now when you get into equations of having variables on both sides, this to me is more like the multi-step. So this is like the middle portion of 6.2. And so, yeah, definitely you're gonna have to solve them with variables on both sides. There's some fractions, so I'm gonna come back to that. So let's do this one. This is my number 28. So we're solving 9x minus 9 equals 6x minus 81. All right, so when you're solving equations like this with variables on both sides, please make that conscious decision before you jump into it of which side you want your variable on. Most people prefer the variable on the left, sometimes get on the right. We'll talk more about that next test when we do inequalities. So I'm just going to assume we're getting the variable on the left. So if we're getting the variable on the left, that means at some point I'm going to do something with that 9, something with that -9, and that 6x. That all the x's need to be on this side, and all the numbers need to be on the right. Right. Now, it doesn't matter if you deal with the -9 first or the 6x first. I know most of you probably been trained to do the constants first. I prefer moving my variables first. So the first 2 steps might be flip-flop for us. But how do we move that 6x over to the left-hand side? Well, I need to move the entire term, so we're using add subtract. It's positive, so I'm going to subtract 6x. 6x minus 6x is 0. And when we do one side, we got to do the other. 3x minus 9 equals -81. And as always, be careful with those negative signs. And the reason I like to do that first, because now we're right back to what we did with 26. And so we're going to add 9 to both sides. That goes to 0. 3x equals -72. And then it's 3 times x, so we divide both sides by 3. So we get x equals negative, is that 24? Yeah, -20. All right. But if you slow down and say, okay, which side am I getting the variable to? not only does it help when you have variables on both sides, it kind of just tells you what needs to move. When you get to the formulas, that's also a useful habit to begin. All right, so this is standard multi-step equation you're going to have to deal with. Now, there's also going to be equations with fractions. So this is my number 30. So we have z over 5 minus 1/3 equals z over 6. All right, so how do we solve an equation that has a bunch of fractions? Well, we could treat the fractions as fractions. Like, for example, you could subtract z over 5 from both sides. And then, but that's just messy. I like fractions, and I prefer to not have fractions in my equations. So this is where we talked about clearing the denominator. So we need the LCD, and we're looking for the entire equation. So always start with the base number. Is it 6? Well, 3 will go into 6, 6 will go into 6, but 5 won't. Okay, so we have to go bigger. Now, there's a couple ways you can do this. I like starting with my biggest number, start doing multiples of that. 6, 12, 18, 24, 30. And then what I'm looking for is something that's divisible by both 5 and 3. Well, anything that 6 will go into, 3 will go into. So I'm really just looking at the 5. And so that 30 is the first number that 5 will also go into. 30 is my LCD. If you do 6 times 5, you get 30. You don't have to multiply it by 3 again because 3 already goes into 6. If you did that, you get 90, which would work. It just makes your numbers bigger. But in the end, you should have get the same result. So what do we do with that 30? We're going to multiply every single term by 30, and since they're all fractions, by 30 over 1. Don't forget, if you have a whole number, it still has to be multiplied by the LCD. And so I think for a lot of students, it helps, like that with just 1 instead of 1/3. Put that over 1, so that way everything's a fraction. So that way you're multiplying everything by the LCD. That's probably the most common mistake with these problems is either 1, not knowing how to start it at all, or 2, not multiplying those whole numbers times the denominator for the LCD. All right, so at this point, by the time you get through simplifying, it should have whole numbers. So you can multiply first and then simplify, or simplify first, whichever works better for you. So here we have 30z over 5. 30 divided by 5 is 6, or I like to say 5 1 5 once. It'll go into 36 times. Then we have 6 times z, so that's 6z. Over here we have 30 over 3, which reduces to 10. And over here we have 30 over 6, which is 5. So we have 5 times z, or 5z. So depending on the numbers, you can multiply first, then simplify or divide. Here I'd simplify first, whichever works best for you. Okay. So now we have no fractions. So we have 6z minus 10 equals 5z. All right, so which side do we want the variable to? Well, if it was me, since there's only the only constant in the problem is on the left, I would move my variable to the right. It'd be less steps. But let's see what happens if you want the variable on the left, because this is where a lot of you will be used to. All right, so so we're going to either subtract the 5z over or add the 10 over. We have to do both of those steps. All right, now I would be okay myself subtracting 5z from both sides, but often what happens is if we do that, there's nothing left on this right-hand side. And I see a lot of students just like lose their equal sign. Okay? You always have to have something on both sides. So if you're going to subtract 5z first, you need to remember there's going to be a 0 over here. Okay? So you don't normally put that 0, but with nothing left, there is a 0. So to avoid that for this particular problem, I'm going to move my 10 first. Again, these are unlike terms, so don't add them. We get 6z equals 5z plus 10. Now let's subtract the 5z. It's good. We have a placeholder over here. Z, not X. That gives me 1Z equals 10, or just Z equals 2. But I can guarantee you, you're going to have one, if not two, equations with fractions on this test that you're going to have to clear the denominator. So make sure you know this process. All right. Let's go back to review. Yeah, so on this one, my 31, where that's a -3 and a +4, that's what I was talking about. Go ahead and put those over 1. So that way everything's a fraction. So that way when you're multiplying by the LCD, then you don't forget that. What's the LCD? Well, 2 goes into 4, so 4 is the LCD. So you'd be multiplying every single one of those by 4. Once you do that, then you have a normal equation to solve. All right, solve the proportion. How do you do proportions? Right, first step, do your cross product. So when we have 24 over x equals 6 over 5, the cross product is going to be 24 times 5 equals 6 times x, or you could say 6x equals 24 times 5. The word doesn't matter. Right, and then how do you solve that? That one up right quick. This is my number 32. So we have 24 over x equals 6 over 5. So your cross product. So 6x equals 24 times 5. Then to solve it, do your multiplication. 24 times 5 is 120. And then divide by 6. X equals 20. So it's a portion, 1, because it told us in the problem it's a portion, and 2, it's just a fraction equals a fraction, which is different than the previous problem because it had 2 fractions that were subtracted over here on one side. So we could clear the denominator here if you know what the denominator is. If not, then proportions, fraction equals fraction, do your cross product. That's going to be the most efficient way to do that. Okay. The other thing with proportions, don't forget that if you have a fraction with a negative out front, so let's say I had -5/4 equals something. So if you're going to do your cross product, remember that doesn't say both of them are negative, because if you had a negative, I have a negative would be positive. So what I would do in this case, if the negative's out front, I would put the negative, I'd probably put the negative on top. And then that way, when you do your cross product, you know exactly where the negative's on with one of them, and you're good to go. The other so that's sort of the basic proportion. You also have a little bit more involved proportion. So here's my number 34 on my practice test. It's x minus 1 over 16 equals 5/8. So what does the cross product look like here? So 16 times 5 is good. How do you do 8 times that? Well, you really need to think of that as being in parentheses since it's 2 terms. So it's not 8 times the 1 or 8 times the x, it's 8 times both. So this is really 8 parentheses x minus 1 equals 16 times 5. So before you can actually solve, you need to do the distribution. 8x minus 8 equals 80. And then from there, it's a normal equation to solve. Hopefully by the time you get to the test, you're comfortable with these. Last step, divide by 8. 8 by 8 . 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 8 by Okay. So just like with with order of operations and the basic equations, portions, you're going to have just a real basic proportion to solve, and then one that looks like this. So know how to deal with this situation. Okay, the other thing with proportions is word problems. So we don't do many word problems this unit. We kind of the rest of the test we do a ton of word problems. It's just the nature of the content. So for this test, our proportions are going to be our word problems. So here's number 36 of mine. So you're going to have, you'll be solving equations, then you'll solve proportions, then you'll get into word problems. These word problems are proportion word problems. And so there's two kind of possibilities here. One, and again, you have these in the homework, you have them in the quizzes, where it tells you to set up the portion first. So when it says do not simplify, that means don't solve it. Just put in the numbers where they're supposed to be, then they're going to have you solve it. Okay. Or you might have one, you might have one of each, where it doesn't give you the setup, it just says solve it. Okay. You have to be a little bit careful on the ones that have the setup because they tell you specifically what goes in top, what goes in bottom. So, like if I was reading this problem and doing it without their setup, so volume of a person's blood is proportional to the weight. So a person weighs 170 pounds, is approximately 5 quarts of blood. If I was to read that by itself, I would put 170 pounds on top, 5 quarts of blood on bottom, because pounds came first, quarts came second. Okay. Um, but notice here in the problem, to complete the portion where the ratios have volumes of blood in the numerator, so they're telling you volume of blood has to go on top, and body weights in the denominator, so it goes in the bottom. So it's actually flipped. Okay. And they actually can, put the x equals on the left where we normally like do our setup on the right. So since they want volume in the numerator, we'll estimate the number of quarts of blood in a person's who weighs 90 pounds. So we don't know the quarts, but we do know that unknown goes with 90 pounds. And so then how do you set up your other fraction? Well, body weight's in the denominator, so that 170 pounds has to go in the bottom, and then 5 quarts with that 170 pounds. Okay. So on the word problem, proportion word problem, if they make you set it up, pay extra attention to what they say goes on top and what goes in bottom. All right. And again, don't solve it, just plug in the numbers. Then they'll have you solve it. Now, eh, if they don't give you the setup, then you can set up whatever makes most sense to you. You don't have to follow their specific guidelines. All they care about is what do you get after you do your cross product? What is x equal to? Okay. So expect a couple of those on the test. Okay. So that's 6.2. So the last part of the test is the formulas. Okay. And so on the formulas, and I talked about this in the video, you've seen it in the homework, is some of these formulas we're going to give you the values. So I give you H, you don't have to know any of your formulas. They're going to be given to you in every single problem. So don't worry about that. Just, here's the formula. I know H is 23. I know little b is 18. I know capital B is 19. So we're giving you everything on one side. So you plug it in and basically you're just doing order of operations. That's the most basic version of a formula where we give you everything, plug it in, you don't have to solve, we just do order of operations. All right. Now here may look the same, but if you notice, we know D and we know T and we don't know R. So how do you do something like this? So we're still giving you the number, so still the more basic version of this, but now we're going to have to solve. So we have D equals RT. We know D is 93, T is 31. So what I'd like to do on this is, Just check, do a check mark. I know D, I know T, and don't know R. So R is what we're trying to solve for. So since we have numbers given, plug those numbers in. 93 is R. Now, anytime you have variables right next to each other, remember that does mean times. So that's R times T or R times 31. And now, in this case, we actually have to solve because we want to know what is R. So we have to isolate R by itself. When in doubt, my biggest recommendation, my tip on this is pretend the variable you're solving for is X. And ask yourself, how would you solve for X? Because we're so much more used to solving for X than our other letters. Well, this is 31 times R, so you just divide both sides by 31. And 93 divided by 31 is 3. So then we have our answer. So that's a slightly more complicated version of the formulas where we give you the values because you actually have to solve rather than just like if we gave you R, then you would just done R times 31. All right, let's go back to the practice test. Yeah, and I'm not doing every single problem on here as you're studying. If you have questions and you want to go over more of these problems, send me an email. We can set up a Zoom, and go through like your specific questions on your specific problems. I have no problem with that. I would say this Saturday, I'm busy, so Saturday's probably off, but most any other day, even after after hours, I am fairly flexible on my schedule. So usually, if I know at least a day in advance for like after hour stuff, then I can make it work. All right, so you know, here's another formula. That's circumference equals 2 pi r. You don't have to know what all this stands for. You just have to be able to use it. They tell you C is 7.47, pi is 3.14, so they don't know R. And don't use your pi button on the calculator, because if you do, then you get extra decimals. And so those extra decimals might be enough to throw off your answer. On the test, they'll probably give you full credit. Just, if they're telling you pi is 3.14, then just use 3.14. So you would do 2 times 3.14, divide both sides by that number, get your R. Now, something on this where it says round to the nearest hundredth as needed. Sometimes that confuses students because they don't get, like, they might get a whole number or they might get like an answer that has 1 or 2 decimals. That's what that as needed means. So the only time you'd have to round to the nearest hundredth is you have at least 3 decimal places. Because the second decimal place is the hundredth, and then you need the third decimal place to know to round up or keep it the same. So that's what that as needed means. So just because it says round, you don't always have to round depending on how many decimal places the answer goes to. All right. So here is the second style of the formulas, and these tend to be the most missed problems on the test. There's always like a messy order of operations problem that gets missed. The equation with fractions gets missed a lot. But these formulas where we don't give you values, these are the most missed ones. And you're going to see 2 of these on the test. One's going to be a little bit more basic, like these first couple examples, and then you'll have a messier one. All right, so this one, A equals 8 pi d. So and we're solving for d. This is my number 42. So we have A equals 8 pi d. We're solving for d. All right. So when we solve for d, that means we need to get d by itself. That means everything else needs to go over to the other side. Which is why we were doing the equations and I talked about like identifying which side you want your variable on. Part of that was leading into these formulas. All right, so what's the connection between the 8 pi and the d? Well, it's 8 times pi times d. You could do this in 2 steps and divide once by 8 and once by pi. But since they're both times d, you can do this in one step and just divide both sides by 8 pi. They divide by 8 is 1, pi divided by pi is 1. As soon as you get your variable isolated, stop. Don't do anything else. If you do, there's a good chance you might introduce mistakes in the simplifying process. So just isolate your variable, stop. All right. And what makes these challenging is that you're still solving equations just like you were in 6.2. Now it looks different because we have all these variables instead of numbers. So here's my 43. That's capital X equals capital K plus FD. Wants us to solve for K. So what are we trying to do? What's our goal? Well, our goal is to isolate K. So that means anything that's not K has to move over to the other side. So what do we do with this FD? Well, this is plus FD. So that, to get that whole term over is add extract. So it's added. So we need to subtract it. So we subtract FD. FD minus FD is 0. That's why we did it. Now on this left-hand side, how do you deal with X minus FD? Well, the answer is you don't do anything with it because they're unlike terms. So it's just X minus FD, nothing else to be done. You have K by itself. So there's your answer. And make sure in MATLAB that you do upper and lowercase, just like it is in the problem. On the test, I'd give you full credit if you put like a lowercase x, but MATLAB would count that wrong. So just watch out for that. So even though these look messy, these are still basic one-step equations. It's just now instead of solving for x, we're solving for something else. Now they're going to get messier. So you'll have a basic one sort of like this. Yeah, let's do both of these. And you're going to have some that are more than one step. So here is 44. So we have y equals fx plus s. We're solving for f. All right, so if we're solving for f, to me that says this is going to stay on the right-hand side. I need to move the x, and I need to move the s. So how are we going to do that? Well, that x is times f. So at some point, we're going to have to divide by x. And so this is one of the tricky parts is you're used to solving for x. Now it's one of the terms we're moving. So I understand that can be confusing. That's part of the why these problems are missed. Now, say for this class, we don't do a lot of these, but you're going to see one like this on the test. Okay. So we need to move the x, and we need to move the s. So which one do we do first? Well, for moving the x, opposite of multiplying by x, we're dividing, and we always save division for the last. So let's move the s first. So how do we get that s over to the other side? Well, that's plus s. The opposite of adding s would be subtracting s. That was minus s, we add it to both sides. Now, what do we do with y minus s? Those are unlike terms, so we can't do anything with them. And so now remember, we're trying to solve for f. So we need to divide both sides by x. So we divide that side by x and then divide the entire side by x. And then stop because now we have f equals. So again, as soon as you get that variable isolated, you're done. Okay. So similar idea for the last one. All right, so we have capital A equals P. These are all capital letters. It's PRT. We're solving for capital R. So when I see that, that tells me this P by itself has to move and the PT has to move. Well, P and the T are multiplied. times the R. So actually, I see this to be the same as the last one. So that variable we're trying to solve for, at some point we're going to divide by PT. Sometimes we're going to move this P. So we do our add subtract first. So you subtract P from both sides, that zeroes that out. You have A minus P. Can't do anything with that because they're unlike terms. Now, we could divide these in two steps, but since they're both multiplied, then just to go ahead and start by dividing both sides by PT. Because P divided by P is 1, T divided by T is 1, leaving us with R. Okay. And then over here on the left-hand side, we have A minus P is P over T. And again, stop here. There are ways to simplify that legally. But at this stage, I would say most students would simplify it incorrectly because like simplifying this is really more of a college algebra level topic. Okay. If you're comfortable with it, then you can, but you've got the variable isolated, so there's no need. All right. So when it comes to the test, like I said, expect 4 formula problems. You're gonna, there's gonna be a high end one. So like this would be one of these would be like a good last question for the test. You're gonna see like a low end where we don't have any numbers, where you just do like here we just did one division, here we just did one subtraction. That's pretty basic. And then you're gonna have ones where you have numbers to plug in. You have a couple of those. All right, so hopefully this helped. Again, you get to do these quizzes multiple times, so don't be afraid to take them more than once. Again, if you once you get a grade that you like, a lot of times students will, just particularly on like the skill checks or the mini review, they'll go back and just they'll study the ones they missed and then just like do those. You don't have to take like you don't have to take the entire quiz every single time once you have a grade that you like, because it's always the highest grade. All right. Well, like I said, hopefully this helps. And if you want more information, either on a specific question or if you have a topic you'd like to talk through, please email me and we can set up getting the help you need. And then, like I said, this test for the first attempt is due by Sunday, September, was it 14th or 12th? September 14th by 11:59 p.m. Even if you don't feel like you're ready for this test, take the test by Sunday, because that way when you retest, you at least know what the test looks like and you'll be more efficient at studying for the retest. If you do feel like you need a retest, then basically you'll have 2 weeks to study on your own. Or if you want help, let me know. And then you'll go back in honor log and retake the test, just like you took it the first time. All right. That's all I have. Have a good day.